preparing. And we are live.
Good evening. I'm Scott Harris, Executive Director of Museums at the University of Mary Washington in Fredericksburg, Virginia. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this program by one of our institutions, the James Monroe Museum, and it's entitled Women in the American Revolution with Dr. Barbara Oberg. Before I introduce our guest, I want to thank the sponsors that make possible all of the public programs presented annually by the James Monroe Museum. These sponsors include the Fredericksburg Savings Charitable Trust, the Paul and Jane Jones Trust, which is administered by Trustee Walter Sheffield, the Stuart Jones Charitable Trust, and the Friends of the James Monroe Museum. We greatly appreciate their support. We're also grateful for the support and collaboration that we enjoy on many programs, including this one this evening, with our colleagues at UMW's James Farmer Multicultural Center. I remind our audience on Facebook Live that you may post questions for Dr. Oberg throughout the conversation in the comments section to the right of your screen. Our public programs coordinator, Lindsay Crawford, who is administering the live broadcast, will collate these questions and pose them to our guest. For the people in the webinar, you should also use the comment box, and we would ask that the webinar participants during the presentation go ahead and silence or turn off their mics and their cameras during that point. And I said comment, but I guess chat is what we really mean in terms of where you webinar people can put your questions. We do promise we'll get to as many of the questions as time allows, and we do ask you to keep them as succinct and on topic as possible. Dr. Barbara Oberg is Senior Research Scholar in the Department of History at Princeton University. She graduated from Wellesley College with the BA and received her PhD from the University of California, Santa Barbara. In addition to Women in the American Revolution, Gender, Politics, and the Domestic World, the book that will be subject of her discussion this evening, Dr. Oberg co-edited Benjamin Franklin, Jonathan Edwards, and the Representation of American Culture from the Oxford University Press, and Federalists Reconsidered from the University of Virginia Press. She has published numerous articles and given many lectures and talks on Franklin, Jefferson, and their worlds. She is also a past president of the Society for Historians of the Early American Republic, the Association for Documentary Editing, and the Society for Textual Scholarship. Dr. Oberg was editor-in-chief of the Papers of Benjamin Franklin at Yale University, and later editor-in-chief of the Papers of Thomas Jefferson at Princeton University. Upon her retirement from Princeton in 2014, her history department colleague, William Chester Jordan, hailed her as the guiding light in the publication of the Papers of Thomas Jefferson. And we are so pleased to welcome to our virtual stage Dr. Barbara Oberg to discuss women in the American Revolution.
That's a very, very generous introduction, Scott, and I thank you. I have to tell you that, you know, when my children would be asked, what does your mother do? And they would say, well, actually, her job is reading other people's mail. And that's what I've been doing for my career. I've read Jefferson's and Franklin's and many other people, and it is a good way to learn history, I think. Anyway, it's a pleasure to talk with all of you at the University of Mary Washington. It'd be nice to be here in person together, but another time. Let me tell you how the book, Women in the American Revolution, got started. It had its origins about 10 years ago when I had a phone call from the President General of the Sons of the American Revolution. Would I, he asked, organize a conference where historians could come together, talk about their research? We began by asking questions. What was the state of the field and how had it changed over the previous decade? Which questions had been answered and which required additional investigation? Did women really have a role in the movement for independence? Did the war change their place, their status in American society or the economy? How did a woman survive the difficulties presented by the revolution? And would the skills she learned in wartime be of any use to her in peacetime? Would she be prepared to move back into a traditional female place in society when she had, at least in part, been living in a society that blurred gender lines And in fact, sometimes they acted much more independently, and I'll talk some about that. Answering these questions and recovering the lives that women lived during the Revolutionary era has been much more difficult than understanding and explaining the lives of white men. Although women constituted half the population, they typically left behind far fewer records than women did, partly because often women did not read or write as much as men, and partly because writings by women were often thought not worth keeping. They simply were not kept. Because women could not vote, serve in public office, or lead armies, what they wrote was typically regarded as ephemeral or unimportant. Such records were often discarded or destroyed. In fact, women sometimes collaborated in the destruction of their own papers. For example, in the 2.5 years between George Washington's death and his wife's, she burned all their private correspondence to prevent prying eyes from seeing the intimate details of their marriage. I think she was somewhat conflicted about taking this step because, though she wanted privacy for her papers, like many others of that generation, she thought it important to be able to pass on the early history of the country to the generations to come. Martha Jefferson, too, just disposed of her papers, instructing her husband, "On my deathbed, please burn all my letters." I've chosen a few stories from the book to share with you, and I'll deal with each separately, keeping two things in mind. First, each can stand as a story on its own and deserves full attention. Each is unique, and I want to preserve that uniqueness. These individual stories deal with, just for example, Black midwives on plantations, Mary Willing Byrd of Westover Plantation, Martha Washington, and I have looked for similarities, common themes among them. But at the same time, I've chosen these four is because they all have in their center the economic side of women's lives in the Revolutionary era. This, I think, is quite fascinating as we watch how they deal with the economy, the challenges they faced, the inventive, original way in which some of them overcame the difficulties in front of them, the contributions they made to the advancement of women in society. They helped lay the groundwork for who we are today. All of these women faced the political and economic uncertainties of the Revolutionary period and found a way to be independent and self-reliant. We will follow their journey. As we began looking into these questions, we expanded the list of women about whom we could say she played a part in the revolution. We discovered that women were drawn into the task of direct military resistance to a far greater extent than we had appreciated. And we thought historians of the revolution should make room for the women who boycotted British goods or contributed food for the troops on the march. Hundreds of women and children did this, some of them also functioning as nurses, laundresses, and cooks. They hauled water for the soldiers who fired cannon. They brought blankets and food to men on the front lines and offered words of encouragement whenever they could. They defended their property, livestock, and equipment. When British troops arrived, sometimes even destroying their crops. Lindsay, you can show that slide. Our goal was to expand the list of women crucial to our history, beyond Abigail Adams, Dolly Madison, and Mercy Otis Warren. What we knew about them was not unimportant, but others who were far less well known were also crucial to the success of the revolution. Lots of women in this category. Out of the many stories like these, I have chosen just a few to serve as case studies to discuss in greater detail. Each offers an account of a woman breaking out, at least to some extent, from the traditional circumscribed life that she had known and that laid out the norms for proper female behavior. Each story stands on its own, but they have a common theme, moving into an economic world unlike that which they had always known. Kate, an enslaved Black woman, who served as a midwife at Mount Vernon and asked to be paid, is one of the ones whom I will discuss. Next, Mary Willing Byrd, the mistress of Westover Plantation on the north bank of the James River. At first sight, she seemed to be just a traditional plantation mistress. We will end with Martha Washington, who needs no introduction. Mary Washington, of course, is very important too, but she doesn't quite fit with this group. But as George Washington's mother, she's important. She may seem like an anomaly on this list. She did not have to rebel, but she carved out a new role for a wife that was far more serious and important than simply being the general's wife or the president's wife. These stories add to our knowledge of the American Revolution and the place of women in it, but they do more than that. They become part of the large canvas of the history of women. Elizabeth Graham Ferguson, who lived just outside Philadelphia, is a good example. She was a poet and renowned hostess, a salonière, she would be called in France, who on Saturdays gathered intellectually curious men and women, just as was done in Paris, to share and discuss readings and have polite conversation. She secretly married Hugh Henry Ferguson in 1772, but the marriage did not work out well for her. She had to endure many, so it is said, infidelities, as well as frequent absences. His sympathy for the crown and allegiance to Britain was obvious. That was the big problem. When he evacuated Philadelphia with the British troops, she did not go to England with him, and she began to call herself, now we might say self-identify, as an American. While her refusal to move to England with her husband might not immediately sound like something connected to the success of the Revolution, it was a symbol of a patriotic act. It took strength and a strong sense of independence to abandon her husband simply because she disagreed with his loyalty to the monarchy and his support of the British government. And she was an example of how, in a time of economic, social, and political uncertainty, women would become more self-sufficient. We can put up Mary Willing Byrd's portrait now. She struggled through many challenges in her adult years. In 1777, her husband, William Byrd III, died, possibly by suicide, leaving Mary, the single parent of their 8 children, to be the sole executor of his grand but heavily indebted estate. This highly unusual act was very meaningful because it was a sign of his confidence in her fiscal and legal abilities at a time when Virginia men were giving less and less power to their wives, and very few of them deemed women capable of serving in that role. 4 years later, the British Army invaded and occupied her plantation. Troops seized and destroyed her crops, tools, livestock, food, furniture, and farming equipment. Half the slaves, seeing a way to freedom, ran behind the British and escaped. According to legal standards of the day, Mrs. Byrd occupied an ambiguous place in the state. She paid taxes, bore the responsibilities that came with being a slave owner, both of which would have been up to her husband. She faced many, many challenges in her adult years. In 1777, her husband, the eminent William Byrd III, nearly drove his estate into bankruptcy and then died, quite possibly by suicide, leaving Mary the single parent of their 8 children. He had already selected her to be the sole executor of his grand but heavily indebted state. I hope you enjoy seeing the portrait of her. She's very elegantly dressed. She has a fancy headpiece on, and of course, a dress made of silk with a low neck. Notice her long hair. She is a typical 18th century woman in the way she looks. He had already selected her to be the sole executor, or executrix, if we're going to be gender specific, because it was a sign of his confidence. Very few Virginia men deemed their wives capable of serving in that role. She lived another 37 years and thrived, rescuing the estate for her children. She's been called an independent economic dynamo. I love that phrase, an independent economic dynamo. Modern words, but it does in fact describe her very nicely. 4 years later, the British Army invaded and occupied her plantation. Troops seized and destroyed her crops. Half of the slaves ran away, seeing a way to freedom with the British Army. You can put the image back if you want of the destruction of the fields. Yes, that's good. Actually, by the way, this belongs in a museum in Los Angeles, and the woman there who is tearing up the wheat was one of the Schuyler sisters. And if any of you have seen Hamilton, you know that she was an important person to Aaron Burr. You know, it's strange to think of destroying your own crops, which you would use to feed your own family. I think it shows you how desperate they were not to help the British in any way at all. But I think it's a fabulous, fabulous painting. Half of the slaves, as I said, seeing a way to freedom, ran behind the British Army and escaped. She paid taxes, bore the responsibilities that came with being a slave owner, and supported her 8 dependents. He killed himself and he had 8 children. Sad to think of. She managed to fashion for herself an identity as a citizen, plantation manager, mother, and slaveholding mistress, an identity that allowed her to negotiate the rapidly shifting economic and political worlds. Fortunately, because of her family's elite status, many of her letters and papers were preserved. Historians have made good use of them. Now, the next is not a story of a woman, it is a story of several women, but I find it fascinating, and I think that it has enough touches of the major figures in the American Revolution to be worth telling you about. This is the story of midwives, and it brings to light an underground economy of enslaved Black women before, during, and after the Revolution. Trained as midwives, often by white women, they delivered not only the babies of enslaved women on plantations, but of white women, the wives of plantation owners. Black midwives often learned their skills from white midwives, and this was one of the only few opportunities for interaction between whites and Blacks. Sometimes the work of Black midwives required them to travel away from their home plantations, giving them a kind of geographic mobility that few other slaves had. Now, I'm not saying that means they had a better life, but it's interesting to look at away from the plantation. What were their lives? What could they possibly be away from the home plantation? They cared for new mothers, provided general health care, not just for the enslaved population, but for white people. Both men and women could work as midwives. We get an amazing glimpse into one aspect of midwifery from George Washington's archives. While he was back at Mount Vernon during his second term as president, Kate, one of the slaves on his property, requested that he pay her for her work as a midwife. She was, she said, as qualified as the other midwives, presumably white and free, and they received 15 pounds a year for the job of midwife. Now, to ask the President of the United States to pay a slave for work that she was doing on his plantation was gutsy indeed. The record of it is only a few lines jotted down on a random scrap of paper in his archives. It's amazing how lucky that is. People tend to throw away scraps of paper. You probably do it, I do it. But anyway, that was an important document for us to have because it tells us something important about the slave society. Now, we would not have known about that piece of paper if the archives had not been searched carefully. And it's important to realize that you can't just go through the archives. I say this because I've done this sort of for my life, reading other people's mail. You can't just go through and say, oh, this doesn't look very important, we'll get rid of it. Every scrap of paper has to be considered very carefully. Every scrap of paper is important in some way. This is proof that historians must continue to search archives and read documents over and over. There's one irony about midwives, I think, though it's kind of hard to understand. They were taking good care of enslaved new mothers, which was a humane thing to do. The babies were also carefully tended. On the one hand, this was a humane thing to do. On the other hand, the result was continuing existence of slavery, and in fact, growing. If there are more slaves born, there will be a larger slave population. So, it's something of a balance. Successful childbirth added the slave population. What we have not been aware of is this. Why have we not been aware of it? And many other things about women's lives. We haven't because, alas, there's not enough about that in the documentary records. The sources are just not there. Few working women had the leisure to write letters or keep journals. Most archives that are available to us preserved are only manuscripts of the American Revolution generated by men. There are far fewer records by and about women. They just didn't leave documentary traces. And so historians have had to reconstruct their lives from newspapers, wills, city directories, and a husband's journal. The paucity of documentary sources makes the scrap of paper that we just talked about in George Washington's records even more significant. Having looked at stories that are not part of that have not been part of the canon, it's only fair that we pay attention to one which is. And from this example, we learn that a single event can prompt us to pay attention to something that we thought we already knew. And Martha Washington could go up now. Yes. She has a wonderful thing in her hair. She's very dignified and stately looking. Certainly can be a president's wife or a general's wife. A single event can prompt us to pay attention to something we thought we already knew. For Martha Washington, that event was the commemoration in 2000 of the 200th anniversary of her death. That led historians to embark upon an ambitious search for anything at all about her life. It's interesting, the way we celebrate, whether it's a birth, a death, or a big event, as is the American Revolution, and 2026 is already shaping up as a major event to be studied in many ways. And I suspect there will be a lot more searching of the archives as we get ready to celebrate that. Now, one thing that we learned was how long when Martha was with George in the Army. By carefully examining the records and counting the numbers, research historians discovered that of the 103 months of the war, April 1775 to December 1783, Martha spent between 52 and 54 months, either with her husband in camp or hovering close by so that when there was a chance, they could be together for the two of them to spend time. Up until now, we knew Martha sometimes visited George when he was in camp or close to the battlefield, but lacked specifics. Now we know exactly how much time they spent together. That she was willing to live a life that was far from life at Mount Vernon, with none of the comforts and help that she was used to, indicates the strength and strong love of her husband, I think. A drink of water. We do not know enough about her life. She did not keep a diary, and her husband kept one only for a short period of time. He corresponded with a cousin who was the manager of Mount Vernon, but even though the letters reveal little about her, they were mostly about the estate. Unfortunately, they were all destroyed. Even sadder is that in the 2.5 years between George Washington's death and hers, Martha, as I said, turned to burning things. She burned 40 years of correspondence. And Jefferson's wife did the same thing. What Jefferson's wife did was ask Jefferson to burn everything, destroy everything, which he did, I'm sorry to say. And we can't really count on gaining a lot of information about Martha from biographers, because many of them in the 19th and 20th century, and first half of the 20th century, focused on George Washington and dismissed any impact she might have had on his life, except the financial one, because she brought money to the marriage. She came from a much wealthier background than he did, and it was her money that enabled the rapid rise into the upper strata of Virginia gentry that the two had. Lest I give you the impression that he was primarily after her money that she brought, I hasten to add that her social skills and contacts were also important in Washington's success. During 8 long years of the Revolution, she came to know many of the most important figures of the day, to see parts of the country beyond Virginia, and to serve as a bridge between her very busy husband and officials, foreign and domestic, who came to meet with him. These are fascinating stories. When he was president, when he was general, she was the go-between, and she had diplomatic skills, so she handled things very, very well. During the hard winter of 1777 to 1778 at Valley Forge, she presided over a circle of officers' wives in her sewing room. She was the perfect model for an officer's wife. Washington was the leader of the army, but she was something of a leader herself. From the social leadership skills she was developing, she was quietly being transformed into this nation's first lady. Obviously, she didn't know it. Something she would not even realize until many years later. Moving from writing about the position that elite women like Martha Washington held during the Revolutionary era, several historians have now turned their attention to the place of regular or ordinary women. Throughout the war, either out of love for their spouses or the economic necessity of supporting themselves, or both, the wives of common soldiers often followed their husbands during campaigns, sometimes with small children in tow. In camp, wives took on the role of cooks, laundresses, and nurses. While women slowed down the army on the march, they also provided invaluable services. It was something of a trade-off. I should also note that there were other women with soldiers in addition to their wives. These are the camp followers. That's what they're called. You could call them prostitutes too. Responding to the awkwardness of the situation, commanders-in-chief were warned that they should take all possible care that no lewd woman come into camp. George worried about Martha. He was concerned about how she would get along without him, a fact that comes across strongly in a series of letters he sent to relatives in the summer of 1775, not long after he was appointed commander of the Continental Army. After all, 17 years earlier, Washington had exchanged his military career for life on a plantation and a seat in the Virginia House of Delegates of Burgesses. He did this, apparently, because Martha, then his wife-to-be, begged him to give up the military life. Both he and she worried about what would happen to their papers, the family correspondence, the financial records and letters, which he had exchanged with army officials and members of the government. He succeeded in finding a place that would be safe for his wife and the papers. She insisted on packing up all those papers in a trunk and preparing them for a speedy evacuation if need be. She must have realized on some level how important the preservation of documents was and played a part in ensuring this got done. Actually, she was not alone. John Adams, Abigail Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, the key people during that founding period were very conscious of what these papers were to do for the future of the country, and they saved them as best they possibly could. Martha knew that preserving the history of the Revolution for future generations would be important, and that it was not just men's responsibility to do that. It was a woman's too. She had experienced the reality of wartime, but could envision a time after the war when the country could move forward in a peaceful world. With many more documents now available, we have a more complete, complex, and nuanced understanding of Martha and her compatriots. And we know better than to discount the female experience. Women were drawn into the task of direct military action to a far greater extent than we have appreciated. Women carried water, as I said above. Each company in the Army had its own share of women, usually, but not always, soldiers' wives and occasionally mothers. Women helped to make musket balls out of their pewter dishes and molten pellets out of the lead statues of Royal George. One statue in New York that they tore down yielded 42,000 musket balls. So George could be very useful. Even if we don't know precisely how many women served, we know that a number did. It has been estimated that over 10,000 women served in the American Army. Some came because they genuinely wanted to help the cause. Some came for adventure, but many came simply because they had no money and serving with the Army would give them food to eat. Why have a woman in the field of women's history? Why have they not paid attention to this? Well, women's historians have tended to be doing more modern fields. I think that has begun to change, but it used to be that the 20th century, that those women were important and worth studying, but the early days were just the early days. As I say, though, that is way, way out of date now. And the colonial and revolutionary periods have some of the best historians in the field. Our goal was to see the world as women themselves saw it, and not let ourselves be distracted by traditional male conceptions of it. And studying the well-known and the elite need not be snobby. If we read these elite sources thoughtfully, they will lead us to a greater appreciation of ordinary people. They are all Americans and all part of our history. Our understanding of the American Revolution is never set once and for all, nor should it be. And I can't close without quoting Abigail Adams. Remember the ladies. I do, and I agree with that. I'd like to talk for a minute about the big editions of the papers of the founders. I'm sure some of you have heard about them, know about them. If Dan Preston is on now, he knows. I want to tell you how these got started. Right after World War II, Franklin Roosevelt said to an American historian whom he knew, his name was Julian Boyd, we need to do something about making our papers available, because people are going to need them. That was in 1942 or 43. The Jefferson Papers then began at Princeton University and have now made it up to 1807, I think. So there's a way to go, but every single one of those volumes is scrupulously done. And it's amazing how from time to time it becomes relevant to contemporary events. So that's why I think it's important. And I'm delighted that you're here to hear this. And we could try and do some questions if you'd like.
Perfect. Let me go ahead and start my video. So this is just a encouragement for anyone in the webinar, as well as anyone on the Facebook Live to ask some questions. Thank you so much for a great lecture. I appreciate it. I will go ahead and start with one question. It is that, did women of this period who left memoirs discuss their gender's potential in political process as voters? By any chance?
I don't think so. Of course, they didn't use the word gender then. So no, I have not seen anything that it would be that explicit, but we might find something if we keep searching the archives. It's a good question.
Correct. Thank you. Carolyn Cook asked, how can we preserve women's history for future generations today with the fast pace of social media when so much is coming out all at once?
That is a good question, and it's a challenge. I feel so lucky that I just work, the sources I work with are on paper, written in pen. I think that's going to take a lot of consistent attention to it. And I know that places, well, Princeton University has done a great job of keeping the records, the digital records, and social media. It's a challenge. I think it's important to do it, but we don't yet have all the tools to do it, but we're working in that direction. And that too is a good question.
Perfect. Our next question is, did the women who were later politically active in the 19th and 20th century look to women of the Revolution for any inspiration?
Some of them did, not too many. I think the first generation of women, that is, who were fighting for the right to vote, had so much on their plates just to be coping with that. It was a big fight. It was an absolutely big fight for them to do it. And I think that to go back and say, well, think of Abigail Adams and the women of that generation, I think that might have hindered their case, because they needed to be up forefront and really on top of things, current events. So the history, I'm afraid they would feel would be counterproductive, or at least not very productive.
Perfect. Personal question, what is something from editing this book that you found surprising, that you didn't know about before, that you found really relevant, that you'd like to share, that you maybe didn't have time for?
Well, I tried to pick out the highlights. And I think the main thing I didn't know about was midwives. But there are also little stories along the way. And Elizabeth Dickinson Weed was one of the good stories too. She was an apothecary, that is to say, a druggist. And she was married, and when her husband died, they were in the business together. She took over the production of drugs, and one of them was so popular and good that somebody stole the recipe to it and used it. So she sued him for violating her property rights.
Wow, okay. Which back then was a bold thing to do.
Was what? A bold thing to do?
Bold thing to do, yes.
Yes, very much. To sue somebody, if you're a woman, and to sue for the property rights of what you have been working on. No, that was very bold and unusual.
Right, right. Joanna, who spoke to us earlier, asked us, asked you, she's curious to know if your experience knowing that many documents were destroyed. If you could read any collection of letters, whose letters would you have wanted to read?
Oh, gosh. Well, because I'm an 18th century historian, I'm going to limit it to this field.
Mhm.
I think, oh, it might be, I'm trying to be fair to everybody. I think it might be. Well, what Elizabeth Weed would be one, the apothecary. There's also a very interesting chapter in this book that I did not talk about. The name of it is She Did Not Open Her Mouth Further. It is about an Iroquois woman who was very, very active in the tribe. Women were treated Indian Native American women were not treated well during the Revolution. They were political targets and military targets in many ways. So I think that would be something very important, and I would be fascinated to study that. I might have to learn some more languages, though, Native American languages.
Understandably. Someone asked, considering the 10,000 numbers of females serving, where did that come from, that number? And did that include camp followers or other females? Or was this an estimate of the actual female soldiers that participated in the American Revolution?
I think that only the soldiers was
Soldiers.
the person interested in, or the people who worked on it, because they were the real people, you might say.
Right.
So they used whatever rolls and lists they could to come up with that number. And it's hard to know how accurate it is, but it's easier now to find it than it would have been 25 years ago,
Right.
because there are lots of deeds and papers in the records, in municipal records, cities, and if you go through those very carefully, you would be able to see certain things. You get little clues.
Right.
A letter that he sent to somebody, or a little scrap of paper on which he said, "Today I did such and such." So those are the little pieces that make the puzzle
Understandably.
and solve it.
I am going to encourage, if anyone else has any final questions, please submit them now. But I truly appreciate your perspective. I would like to point out that the book that you talked about today is for sale at our museum online store, and it can be purchased. And I highly, as a personal reader, recommend it to get an insight to more of the essays that we did not have time to discuss tonight. I wish we had all night, because I could sit here and discuss it all with you. But I highly recommend it. And it looks like we do not have any more questions. So I'm going to go ahead and end the live, but I wanted to say thank you to our sponsors, and thank you, Dr. Oberg, for a wonderful presentation tonight.
And thanks to all of you for coming and listening.
Perfect. I'm going to end the live now.